This tutorial is to how to answer question 2b, the source follow-up question on paper 1, medicine in Britain, which will be about injuries, treatment and the trenches. This is what the question looks like. Study source A. How could you follow up source A to find out more about, in this case, the work of stretcher bearers on the Western Front? In this answer, you must give the question you would ask and the type of source that you would use. So we'll take the first two parts of this question first of all, a detail in the source that I would follow up. So we go back to the source, and you will have already looked at this source in question 2a when you're looking at how useful the source is, so you will have already been familiar with it. We don't need to comment on who wrote it or why they wrote it or when they wrote it. We just need to read the source, and we need to pick an element of the source that tells us something about the work of stretcher bearers. And I always think that it's easy to get the marks if there's a number in the source and we can follow up on that number. We're going to be able to see if that was an accurate number, if that was the average number of something, if that was normal. At 2 a.m, a terrifying bombardment began, and at 5 a.m, the first batch of wounded began coming down the communication trench. It was evening by the time I got out of the trench to look for more wounded. I went off with another man to search for the wounded. We found most of them in a wooded area, so weak they could not call out. They were so relieved at being found that I led a search for more wounded. It was awful work getting them out of their shell holes. It was also hard to find enough men to carry them away because the stretcher bearers were so exhausted. Finally, we got our last wounded to safety at 4 a.m. the next morning. Altogether, we had collected 18 men in a single day and were certain that no one was left behind. Now, there's a few that there's definitely two sentences we could underline there. I'm going to go with the one with the number in it. Altogether, we had collected 18 men in a single day. We're going to take that sentence and write it word for word in details in the source that I would follow up. We then got to ask a question of that sentence in the source, as a historian would. So I'm going to ask, was that the average number of men collected in a single day by a stretcher bearer? Then we have to look at the second part of the question. So we have our 2 marks here by having a detail in the source and our question that directly links to that detail in the source and directly links to the focus of the question, which is about the work of stretcher bearers on the Western Front. Then we get to the bit about what type of source we could use. So several sources that you can use, and you need to revise these. We need to make sure we put what those sources would show. So National Army records for individual soldiers which show. So that might be the most relevant for whatever the question is asking you. Photographs which show. So it's not enough to just put photographs or hospital records. You need to make sure it links to what that question is asking you. So in this case, we need to find a source that links to the work of stretcher bearers. So I'm going to go with the bottom one, Royal Army Medical Corps records which show the work of a group of stretcher bearers. I then need to link this to how is this going to answer my question above. Was that the average number of men collected in a single day? So if I look at these records, how is that going to help me answer that question? The records would show how many men were taken to the casualty clearing station by stretcher bearers. So that's how we get our 4 marks. Now that source was a written source. So you might also get a visual source. So you might get a photograph. So I'm going to take you through how that would work as well. So this one is a photograph showing a British casualty clearing station on the Western Front in 1916. How could you follow up on source A to find more out about the treatment of battle injuries by medical staff? So this one is all about the injuries, the treatment of these injuries by the medical staff. So everything we do has to link to the treatment of battle injuries by medical staff on the Western Front. So the same way I did with the written source, I'm going to go back to the visual source. I'm going to see what does it show me about the treatment of battle injuries by medical staff. So I can see nurses there tending to soldiers, looking after what looks like head injuries. So the detail is the nurses are bandaging up soldiers' injuries. A question I might ask, how were serious injuries treated? How did they actually deal with these serious injuries on the Western Front? A source I could use a diary entry, but I've got to be specific, a diary entry of a first aid nurse in Yeomanry who had detailed how they dealt with these injuries. It's no good if we just put a diary entry because it's not linked to the treatment of battle injuries, and it's not going to help us answering that question, how were serious injuries treated? And how is this going to help me answer my question? It would tell me the types of injuries they dealt with and how much they were allowed to help with serious injuries. So that's how we would answer the question when it's a visual source, a photograph, because it might be written and it might be visual. So, final points before you attempt these questions on your own. Spend no more than 5 or 6 minutes on this question. So it's 4 marks, and you're going to need a lot of time on your 12 and 16 mark questions on this paper. Make sure that your detail from the source is linked to the focus of the question. Don't just pick any quote out of the source or any detail out of the photograph. Make sure it links to the focus of the question. If it's about stretcher bearers, that's what you saw, the element of the source has to link to. Make sure the question you would like to ask is linked to the detail in the source. Those two questions at the top go together. The detail in the source and the question you would ask of that detail go together. So they need to link together. When you state the type of source, make sure you say which shows and link this directly to that question that you're asking of the source. So it's no good just putting a diary entry or a photograph. You need to say which shows and link that to the focus of the question. And when you complete how this might help me, make sure it helps you answer that question that you came up with in part 2. So that you came up with that question on your own. How is that source going to help you answer that question? Okay, there's 2 more of these questions that you can attempt on your own. I'm going to read you through them, and then you're going to pause the video and answer them yourselves. We have source A, which is from Harvey Cushing's journal, and the question is asking you how you could follow up source A to find more about treatments that were available for wounded soldiers. So we need to read the source and find out about these treatments available for wounded soldiers, and everything you do on this right hand side here has to link to the treatment available for wounded soldiers. So pause the video and have a go at answering that question. Have a go at answering this one as well. How could you use source A to find out more about the impact of the terrain, the land, on the transport of the wounded on the Western Front? Read the source, and everything has to link to the impact of the terrain, the landscape, on the transport of the wounded on the Western Front.